All right, today we're doing a deep dive into a name you probably know, Khong Guan Limited. We're going to get into their latest annual report, peel back all the layers, and really figure out what the numbers are telling us about their business.
So right away, Khong Guan's report throws us a real curveball, a genuine head-scratcher. Their sales went up by a pretty healthy amount, but when the dust settled, they were still in the red. How on earth does that happen? Well, that's the big mystery we're going to solve today.
Okay, so let's start with this core conflict, this contradiction. We're talking about the top line, the total money coming in the door, and how it seems to be telling a completely different story from the bottom line, which is the final profit or loss. I mean, just look at these two numbers side by side. They tell such a fascinating story. On the one hand, you've got revenue hitting 73.4 million Singapore dollars. That's up a very solid 4.6%. Great. But then you look over here and you see a net loss of $153,000. More cash came in, but it just didn't translate into profit.
So let's kick things off with the good news, right? Because an increase in revenue is almost always a fantastic sign. The big question is, where did this extra money actually come from?
And here you can see it, plain as day. We go from $70.2 million in fiscal year 2024 all the way up to $73.4 million in 2025. Visually, that's a really nice, solid step up. But, and this is a big but, the story here is a little more complicated than it looks.
And here is the twist in the tale. You'd think, oh, they must have sold a ton more biscuits, right? Well, not exactly. The report actually shows that their Malaysian businesses saw a small decrease in sales in their own currency. The entire $3.2 million jump we see came from a favorable currency exchange rate. The Malaysian ringgit got stronger, so when they converted that money back to Singapore dollars, it looked like more. It's a currency gain, not a we sold more stuff gain.
All right, so now we have to flip over to the other side of the story, the not-so-good news. Because despite that revenue boost on paper, the company just couldn't escape that red ink on the final balance sheet. Now, a loss of $153,000 is, still a loss, but you have to look at the context. Look where they were just a year ago. They were in the hole for over $1.2 million. So to shrink that loss by nearly 90%, wow, that is a massive, massive improvement.
So what we're looking at here is a story of incredible progress, but they just couldn't quite stick the landing. They made this huge leap. They closed this massive gap from the year before, but they fell just short of that finish line. And now we're going to find out exactly why. This is where we put on our detective hats. We've got a higher revenue, we've got a dramatically smaller loss, but it's still a loss. So what was the roadblock? What was the one specific thing that stopped them from getting into the black?
What's interesting is the company basically told us this was coming. Before the full report dropped, they put out a profit guidance to warn investors, and they pretty much laid out all the clues for us. They pointed to things like setting aside money for unpaid bills in Malaysia, weaker results from those operations, and some losses back home in Singapore.
Okay, let's pause and break down that first point, because honestly, it is the key to this whole puzzle. Impairment allowance on trade receivables. It sounds super complicated, right? But it's actually a pretty simple idea. It's just a pot of money a company has to set aside when they're worried some of their customers just aren't going to pay their bills. And here's the critical part. Accounting rules say you have to count that money as an expense, so poof, it just eats into your profits.
And here it is, the number that basically explains the entire loss. In fiscal year 2025, Khong Guan had to set aside $547,000 for these potential bad debts. Think about that for a second. Over $500,000. That is a massive hit to absorb in a single year.
Now, to really see the impact, you have to compare it to last year. In fiscal year 2024, this allowance was only $60,000. This year, it just exploded to $547,000. That is almost 9 times higher. This one thing, this single line item, is pretty much the smoking gun here.
And if you want to see what that looks like in the real world, check this out. That huge expense was big enough to take one of their key Malaysian subsidiaries, a company called SHC, and just flip it completely. It went from making a profit to posting an $87,000 loss this year, just like that. That's the power of one big accounting provision.
So after a really complex year, right, they had the wind at their backs with currency, but this huge headwind from these accounting provisions. So what happens next? What does Khong Guan think is coming down the road?
Well, the company itself is playing it pretty cautious. They stated in their report, and I'm quoting here, "The The group is cautious about the prospects for the next 12 months as global trade uncertainties and inflationary pressures may weigh on consumer sentiment. Basically, they're worried about the same things we're all worried about: inflation and global uncertainty, and how that might make people think twice before spending their money.
So yeah, looking forward, it really is a mixed bag. You've got these big external challenges looming over everything. But there are some definite bright spots too. They're seeing good things happen with their partners in the flour milling business. And get this, those same partners actually went from losing money last year to contributing a profit this year. That is a fantastic turnaround and something they can hopefully build on.
And that really brings us to the big final question, doesn't it? Khong Guan has shown that it can grow its sales and make massive strides in cutting its losses. But with all these global risks out there and the chance of another surprise expense popping up, getting to consistent profitability is still going to be a tough climb. So what's it going to take to finally get them over the hump for good? Well, that's the story we'll all be watching for next year.